Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this edition of the 502 Project and Class LLC presents the future of cybersecurity technology. Dr. Fisk is going to explain everything from the perspective of the 502 Project. On behalf of Class LLC, I'm excited to be here. There are a lot of places that you could be on the Friday before a Monday holiday. If you're joining us live, thank you for being here. If you're listening to the recording later, thank you for participating at all. This has been a great series. This is the third session in the series, and our objective is to help make people smarter about cybersecurity, whether you are at the beginning of your career or you are seasoned and have plenty of salt in your beard like I do. The objective is to bring experts together to share good content, good knowledge, good wisdom, and good information. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Fisk, and then I'll start introducing our guests. And I hope that you have a great time. I hope that you learn a lot, and I hope that this transforms your perspective about what the future of the profession looks like. Dr. Fisk, you have the floor.
Appreciated. And the first thing I want to do is echo everything that Keon has said. And in particular, thank you all for taking the time this evening, for spending a few moments of your precious time with us. Again, taking the moment to, again, pay attention to what it is that we're doing here. And I want to say very briefly, what we're trying to do with the 502 project is build out a large-scale community of practice online of cybersecurity professionals and cybersecurity aspirants, whether those are high school students or whether those are CISOs looking to transition into another career or finding a new position, or again, just having questions about what it is to do next in cybersecurity. And normally I might go into a little bit more detail specifically about what the 502 project is and the kinds of aims that we're trying to build out. But I think for this final session, the thing that I want to focus on the most for just a few minutes is trust. And one of the things that's been kind of bubbling up through the conversations that I've been having lately and the way in which we've kind of understood this broader community. And the 502 project is, if nothing else, intended to be a giant facilitator of cybersecurity community, connecting to events, connecting to degree programs, connecting to competitions, connecting to student clubs and organizations, and bring all of these amazing and diverse people inside the field of cybersecurity into one place to do nothing other than really spend time with one another, to answer each other's questions, to support one another through the journey into the field, and to ideally change the state of cybersecurity full stop. And as part of that, one of the things that we're really looking to develop out inside of the 502 project and that we're really trying to build are some of the things that we already see inside of this room. So many of the contacts that Keon has brought on for this series of speakers are personal connections, are people that he's worked with or his team has worked with, are people that we know and that have real and meaningful personal connections with. And that's by nature of the fact that they've spent time together, they've worked together, they've spoken to each other, they've hung out together, and they've laughed together and done those things. And all of those things may not seem immediately like cybersecurity to you, but they are, because they engender trust. And those trust relationships are what drive this field at the end of the day. And building that kind of trust makes relationships that allow information to flow in ways that are deeply important, whether we're talking about an oncoming threat that many of us are facing, or just a few of us are, or whether we're talking about mentorship and talking to students about what they need to do next and where they need to go, and in a way that's not simply about finding a job, but about people connecting with each other and bringing each other up. That's what we're trying to build inside of the 502 project. And these kinds of relationships are so hard to find for so many people in this community, especially when you're getting your start. What we're trying to do is build out a community where people can find that trust, where people can connect in those ways, in the ways that many of the people in this room have done. And again, in every single one of the panels that Keon and CLASS-LLC has brought together, you can see the camaraderie, the connection between the panelists, the discussions that they have, and even past that, the conversations that are had in the aftermath of these kinds of events. And so if you're looking for that kind of community and connection, if you're looking to have questions about what it is to do next in cybersecurity, or even if you're just looking for a fellow shoulder to cry on, or commiserate with, or hang out with, and laugh about what you do in here. We're trying to build that inside of the 502 project. And I genuinely encourage you to come in and check us out. We're trying to offer full-scale access to students, to cybersecurity professionals, to aspirant, again, people looking to get into the workforce. And we're trying to build all of that through those very personal connections. And with that, I just want to thank Keon one more time, genuinely, for the work that he's done with his team and CLASS-LLC, in bringing all of these amazing speakers to us and to talk about some of the very serious issues that we face in the future of cybersecurity. And I'll just say this one more time because Keon hasn't said it this time, so I'm going to steal his line just a little bit. And I'm going to say this personally because I couldn't believe it when I heard it the first time, which was every single one of these lectures have been incredibly interesting and engaging, even for people like me who have been doing this for almost 20 years and are incredibly jaded and have heard so many times that we face such a critical threat in cybersecurity and we must do something. But these talks aren't like that. They're meaningful, engaging discussions about what the future of the field is going to be from people who have decades of experience in doing this kind of work. And so again, thank you, Keon. Thank you for bringing your personal connections in to this kind of community. Thank you for, again, hosting all of these sessions. And thank you to all of our panelists, genuinely, for taking the time to come in and hang out with all of us. And again, come and see us on the 502 project. My community manager, John, has dropped a link in the chat. We'll all be in there if you have any questions, also here in the Zoom chat. But again, if you're looking for that kind of community, we're looking to facilitate it. And thank you all for being here tonight. And Keon, I'll pass it back to you.
I present that. Thank you very much for the kind words. For the audience, if you haven't been here before, one of the great things about these conversations is that I worked very hard to bring experts in different fields together to talk about specific conversations. As a review for new participants, in the first month, we talked about the future of cybersecurity careers, and we had a collection of people that talked about what the profession looks like. How do you get in? How do you position yourself for success? If you're a director, how do you move up to a CISO? If you just graduated from school, how do you get your first job? The second session focused on the future of cybersecurity controls. So it was very control centric, and we talked about all kinds of control catalogs and other controls that are normally put in place. This session for this month, focusing on the future of cybersecurity technology, is really an opportunity to talk about infrastructure. As you look at the background of our panelists and as you hear what they have to say, on the outside looking in, it doesn't look like this makes sense, but there's always a method to the madness. Diana is an expert. She won't take credit for this, but I'm telling you, Diana is an expert in artificial intelligence from many perspectives. Zach is an expert in microservices computing. Ron is the expert in everything related to cybersecurity, given what he's done at the National Institute of Standards and Technology for a long time. And Shannon is an expert in many areas. But the specific reason that I invited her is because I think people overlook the value of a system of internal controls when you are using cybersecurity as a driver for success and positive outcomes. Sometimes, if you're not getting budget or resources or other things that are beneficial, go to the CFO, and the CFO is going to approve budget to satisfy financial requirements. And as you spend more and more time in the security profession, what you'll find is that silos don't work. An enterprise perspective or an enterprise wide approach is optimal. And if we can bring microservices from a technical infrastructure along with defining artificial intelligence systems and then doing good system security engineering and having families of controls in place and then using finance and business operations to drive results, well, then everybody working together is going to produce a good outcome. If you're here for the first time, what I've asked our speakers to do is not prepare slides because slides are boring, but just to look you in your digital eyeball and say, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to tell you something that's valuable and that's important. I also don't believe in reading biographies. Diana knows who she is. She can tell you what she wants you to know about her. The same can be said for Zach and for Ron and for Shannon. So we'll start with Diana. It's a specific reason that I'm starting with her. Everybody is compelled to try to figure out AI. What is it? How does it work? What do I do with this generative thing that I keep talking about? Oh my gosh, we have deep fakes and it's going to ruin the world. But if we think about artificial intelligence from a technology perspective, how it works, how it functions, the components and everything that comes together to produce the output is an important topic that is often overlooked. Diana is well positioned to address it. My friend, thank you for joining us. You have the floor.
Thank you so much, Kian, and thank you everybody for being here on this pre-holiday evening, or pre-holiday weekend evening. So I thought it might be nice to start a little bit about it, and it's true, Kian is right. I hear AI expert, and it still feels a little bit strange to me, and it's because it's fairly new that I got interested in, or I got deep professionally into AI. It's actually not new when I got interested in AI, because I got interested in AI in the 1970s. And for anybody out there going, it didn't exist in the 70s. It didn't exist until November 2020 when ChatGPT came around. It actually did exist in the 60s. And it was a professor at MIT created a piece of software called ELIZA. And ELIZA functioned essentially as an AI sort of Turing test. Is it a human when you interact with it as a therapist? And there was a whole lot with ELIZA of how does that make you feel? And what does that mean? There was a lot of sort of repetitiveness in ELIZA, but ELIZA was robust enough that some people were very scared, even back in the 1960s, that it was going to be smarter than them and take over the world. And when I intersected with ELIZA, it was in the 1970s. And I just got really fascinated with how a piece of software could be responding that way, because I was a nascent little programmer doing a little bit with BASIC, and I just did not understand how it could work the way that it did. So I got interested at that point, but I didn't really re-intersect with AI until I was at IBM. I got to IBM right after Watson had successfully beaten on Jeopardy! And a kind of a fun fact about how Watson beat Jeopardy! Is that, yes, this is an amazing piece of NLP, at neuro-linguistic programming. It's amazing. It understands how to process natural language, natural language processing. Friday night. Anyway, it was an incredible piece of technology. But the big win that Watson had over the humans was actually the button action, because Watson could hit the button in a programmatic way, and humans, we have to actually press down the button. So it was amazing that Watson came up with the answers, or rather questions, as quickly as it did. But really what gave it the edge was the ability to hit that buzzer so quickly. Anyway, when I got to IBM, I was at IBM Security, and Watson was being trained. We started to talk about training Watson for security. And I, at this point, didn't know a ton about AI and how a sort of a Gen 0 LLM might work. And I was asking how we were going to train Watson. And I was on a call with a bunch of executives, and I was being told, well, Watson's so smart that all that Watson has to do is basically read everything about security on the internet, and it's going to be super, it's going to be the most intelligent security expert on the planet. And I said, well, Watson better have a really good BS detector then, which I could kind of hear a pin drop after I said that. But I meant it, because as we know, there's a lot about security on the internet that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, that isn't accurate, that isn't right. And as it turned out, yes, who I was talking to and the actual data scientists that were training Watson, there was a big difference. And we trained Watson on a very curated corpus of data. And as I saw how that training went and what happened with Watson, some of the confusion that Watson needed to be helped with, for example, IP. IP can mean very different things in different contexts. In security, we tend to think of it as an internet protocol. It can also mean intellectual property related to data leak prevention. So how does a system find that context? And that I got really fascinated with that. Some other things like hash. You think about salting the hash, right? In cryptography, that means something very, very different than it does if you're cooking. So from there, I continued being interested in deep diving and educating myself as I moved on to Microsoft. Microsoft was very focused on ethics and bias in the use of AI when I was there. So the Aether team was doing a lot of work around that, and then continued my education on things like failure modes and AI and ML, and became a LinkedIn Learning instructor on that, and finally found my way to being a CISO at Protect AI, which is obviously an AI security company. When I landed at Protect AI, I got really interested in how we in security could better understand machine learning and artificial intelligence, because I had found it to be a really hard road to get myself up to speed. I had to do a lot of reading on, deep reading on academic resources. I just didn't find any good resources for learning. So I just all myself, easy resources, nothing in security. It was a lot of it was self-taught, and a lot of it was talking to other people and trying to understand how these systems work. As we know, in 2020, everybody started to look at LLMs, and Gen AI became the big thing. But the thing about generative AI is that it's powered by machine learning. So when someone says, well, that's machine learning, I'm interested in AI security, you're actually really interested in both of them, because ML powers Gen AI. If you think of, there's some great pictures or images out there, and I know we don't have slides, but sort of if you think of AI as the big superset, machine learning is a subset of that, neural programming and deep learning is a subset of that, and that powers generative AI. So machine learning is what's powering generative AI. So we really have to understand how machine learning works and help to secure machine learning. And I was having a hard time talking to security people about here. So I'd gotten deep into AI and machine learning and the security of it, but how was I going to talk to my colleagues, my peers about that? And I started thinking about that important work that CIS has been doing on secure by design and building security in, and realized that building security in hooked us right back into something we all know, the DevOps lifecycle, and then DevSecOps, and how we build security into the development lifecycle. And I looked at that lifecycle, and I was thinking, okay, plan, it starts off with a plan and then code and build. And I kept looking at the machine learning life cycles that the engineers were showing me, and it looked so different. And they were just really obsessed on data preparation. And in code and development in general, the things we think about with data are you using live data to train? Because that's bad. So just don't do it. Separate your training data and your production data. That was our biggest thing with data. But here it is, data preparation. Like, what are we doing? And then training and retraining, and around, there's almost this whole cycle around. There is a whole cycle around model retraining. And I couldn't get them to fit. I looked at how machine learning was built, and it just wasn't making sense to me when I thought of it as DevOps, because it's not DevOps, and I understand that. But then how do we have that? How do we bridge that conversation? Then I was also looking at sort of the second part, when we deploy the machine learning models. Now we've trained them, the data needs to be prepped, the model needs to be trained, but at some point it's going to get deployed out. And when it gets deployed, it runs on software like a SageMaker or an ML Flow, and it needs to be architected and secured in deployment. We need to monitor it in deployment. Started thinking, okay, here we've got a lot more overlap with which is familiar to those of us that didn't grow up as machine learning engineers. This starts to feel familiar as architects and deployers and protectors. So I went back into the original DevSecOps loop, and I remapped it. And I realized that when we think plan and development, for machine learning, that's really more about scope. And again, machine learning that this is going to fuel generative AI. So we get to generative AI through robust, secure machine learning. Plan, is one thing in DevOps, but it was in machine learning, it was more about scope, because you have to actually, the interesting thing is not everything's better with AI. If you read the marketing that's coming out right now, it seems like everything's going to be better. You just put the magical fairy dust of AI over it and everything's going to be fine, and all our jobs will disappear. We're going to get, I think Elon Musk said that we'd all make a lot of money. AI is going to do our jobs and then pay us too. So that's fabulous. But for now, in today, not in Elon Musk's future, What scoping is replaced by, plan is replaced by scope to understand, does it need AI? Will it benefit? Is what we're trying to accomplish going to benefit from AI? And are we capable of doing it with AI? Specifically, is the data available? Because if you can't train the AI with data, it's not going to function the way that you want it to. So is it even something that we can accomplish? And then the next piece is the data preparation. Can we find the data? Is it going to be public data? Is it our own data? How do we clean it? How do we duplicate it? How do we featureize it and prepare it? There are all these different aspects around data and preparing the data. And I started to see that we're mapping this loop. It's just with functions very focused on the work of machine learning, which does differ from the work of traditional development. And we can, just as we did in DevSecOps, we can apply security throughout the life cycle. So as we're scoping what we want to do with the AI, we can start with the initial threat modeling questions. Just as we would in the planning phase of DevOps or DevSecOps, we start thinking about what security, what's the threat, the potential threat, what policies might this application be running under? If my Gen AI, for example, like that airline Gen AI, that chatbot, what told the customer, it's okay, just get rid of your ticket and buy a new one. And then the airline didn't want to actually pay the customer for it. And they said, well, it was just this bot that said it. And the customer's like, yeah, that's your bot. But so that's a consideration. That's a risk for the company to think about. There could be a policy related to the information that bot had given out. So starting with security in the scope phase, is there a risk to us if we put this Gen AI out, or this agent, or this new application? In data preparation, thinking again about the threat modeling, but now refining it around the kinds of data that you're using. And of course, privacy requirements. If we're putting a lot of data into these systems, will that data come back out? And I have read, much as back when I said, hey, Watson better have a good detector if we're going to feed it everything and expect it to figure out what's accurate and what's not. With data too, with data prep, is this the right data? Is it biased data? Because if you train a model on biased data, guess what kind of outcomes you're going to get from that model? The outputs will be biased too. If you are training on big data lakes of information, if it's sensitive PII, for example, or PHI, is it going to be protected in inference, in use? And that's a big question. Again, you hear from a lot of people, oh, it's just training data. Well, those models actually are memorizing a certain percentage of that training data. And under unexpected circumstances, that training data can come back out. And one attack was pretty simple. Someone just prompted a Gen AI with a simple prompt of repeat the word poem indefinitely. So you kind of think, right, these are so smart, these systems, would it just repeat the word poem? That'd be pretty simple. I mean, we'd all get tired, but we can all repeat poem indefinitely. Well, it repeated poem for a while, and then it started to spit out some of its sensitive training data, things like emails and phone numbers. This is part of that as you're data prepping and as you're training and as you're doing the threat modeling, thinking about these kinds of pieces within the process. So it's different from what we think about in DevSecOps, but the security, you can see some of what we brought to the development lifecycle, we absolutely have ability to support and help the machine learning and Gen AI deployments be stronger and more secure. Another thing that I think is really important for security is, I had mentioned, for me at least, it was always just making sure that the developers were not testing with live production data. Don't do that. Use synthetic data, use tokenized data, use something that isn't live data in testing. Well, in data prep and then in model training, because you actually do very often have to use real accurate data to do the training, this also puts the onus on us as defenders to make sure that we've secured the training area for the machine learning engineers and the data scientists. Data scientists love to play. They do things like they use Jupyter notebooks a lot to do some of their pre-analytics, but they use them like notebooks. And I read something last July, I think it was, in Medium, and it simultaneously really frightened me and made me really happy. What it was a data scientist was saying to fellow data scientists, hey, you know what? you know how we have this habit of jotting down these important secrets, things in our Jupyter notebooks, like passwords and API tokens and other secrets. We shouldn't do that if they're not encrypted, because if they're not encrypted, they're safe. So I was very happy to see, I mean, that's pretty wonderful that here's a data scientist being security aware and thinking about security, but also really disturbing to think that there's this whole practice, this whole set of people, really important technical people in many organizations, that don't understand risks and security, and that, yes, of course, you should never ever leave anything like a password unencrypted. As we get to the model training, we again, get things into where we can help, things like securing the notebooks, as I had mentioned. Also, model scanning is another one. If you've heard of public repositories, if you've heard the term Hugging Face, this is a public model repository that's in use. And it's got foundational models that organizations have created and pre-trained. There are some public data sets. It's a wonderful marketplace for machine learning and AI, and to help your organizations to move faster and innovate. So I think really wonderful things that are going on in Hugging Face. But as you know, anything that's public can also have some downsides. And what has started to happen is that some of those models are have embedded malicious code, backdoors, and other operations and attributes that can put organizations at risk and lead to things like sensitive data leakage. So guess what? Security started looking at that and saying, okay, we need to scan it. As I was like, are we scanning these models before we deploy them? And it wasn't a common practice. It's now coming into common practice now that security has become part of the machine learning operations lifecycle. So there's a lot more to look at when you look at the machine learning and the machine learning security operations lifecycle. But really the biggest takeaway, and what I hope everybody here is hearing a little bit about, is that yes, this is new technology. And yes, there's absolutely a learning curve for us in security, because most of us, at least I was not trained as a machine learning engineer. I was not trained as a data scientist. So I had a pretty big, steep learning curve, but it is absolutely worth it to get involved. There's a lot. Security needs to be built in to AI and machine learning in order for it to be robust and resilient for all of us to adopt. And then just one little shout out to my wonderful colleague, Braun. NIST has a CSF has an RMF for AI, a risk management framework for AI. And one thing that's really, really lovely is that it focuses on map, measure, manage, and govern. And it's this really fantastic overlay if you do adopt a form of ML SecOps, and it is becoming more and more common, or AI SecOps, because people like the term AI, that it aligns really, really nicely with the NIST AI RMF, so that you can look at the different phases within the machine learning operations lifecycle that map to the map, measure, manage, and govern functions of the NIST AI RMF. So with that, I think my time is up for this. I really had a wonderful time. And again, I hope that if anything, this inspires you to get a little bit deeper. It's not a mystical, swirling, magical AI is math, and it needs security to help make sure it's going to be resilient for all to use going forward.
So for the audience, you can see why we kicked off with Diana. You can also probably imagine why I invited her to start a conversation about infrastructure, because the technology that we're using is going to make a difference, and the way that we set things up are going to be important, especially from a risk management perspective. Diana, people don't multitask very well. So if you missed it, I live tweeted every link that you mentioned while you were talking. And if you want to add something to it, that would be great. I know you have a specific diagram for AI ops, so I didn't want to just pull a random one off of Google, but if you could post a link to your AI ops model in the chat,
Okay.
I think that would be very constructive and contribute to some of the other references that I provided. As we switch gears, I invite our next speaker, Zach, to come on camera, and he is going to bring to the forefront a great follow-up conversation about microservices architecture. If you look at the NIST standard, 800-204, then they have an A, B, and C, and D is published parts, and there's all kinds of other reference material. Microservices architecture is increasingly being used to develop applications because the smaller code base facilitates faster code development, testing, and deployment. It also allows optimization of the platform based on the type of microservice. And Zach is an expert in this area. He contributed to some of the NIST standards that focus on this. And because it is part of what we're going to deal with in the future, we've gone from mainframes to microservices. I thought it would be constructive to feature another expert in this area to talk about what do we need to know, what do we need to be concerned about, how do we set ourselves up for success related to the future of cybersecurity technology.
Thank you. What a wonderful intro. Thank you everybody for being here on Friday. I'm excited to get to talk some of this. So some of my background, I guess, to give you some context, and then we'll talk about maybe two of the big trends that I see shaping the technology that we're building today. I'll try and give some concrete examples of actually some things I've worked on in this vein. So I started actually working, my very first job was working for an oil pipeline, pulling things off of the mainframe and trying to migrate them into more modern environments. And I eventually moved over and started working for Google Cloud on some of their core stuff. If you made a project, that was my baby for a long time. And through that, I eventually worked on the identity and access management systems there. And we got to work on some cool things. And one of those was a set of technologies called the service mesh. And I eventually went and worked on one called Istio. A few years later, I left Google to help start a company around that Istio project. And because of that work in identity and access management, I actually started to get some close contact with actually one of Ron's colleagues. So funny, I was excited to see Ron on the call. I work very closely with one of his teams around access control and that close relationship around next generation access control. And that's a whole fascinating topic by itself that we should talk about sometime. But that then turned into, while we had this company doing this service mesh thing, and I'll touch on service mesh as an example of a technology that's kind of meeting some of these needs. We got a lot of experience across finance, across government, and similar with the challenges and struggles that folks were facing with microservice architectures. And that then turned into kind of a beautiful relationship with some of those SPs, the 204 series, which I help author pieces of, with some of Ron's extended team, and as well as 207A, which covers some of the zero trust principles as well, and particularly like a runtime definition for zero trust. Another fascinating topic we're not going to get into too much. When I look at kind of where I see cybersecurity technology and the evolution, I see kind of two key themes. One is that we want policy to be more and more contextful. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute, but that's the steady march. And the second piece that we kind of seems in tension in the context that Keon laid out of this proliferation of applications that are running in new places and heterogeneous environments, those in highly dynamic environments at that. Those challenges kind of make us want to pull security down into a common layer, right? Because there's all this madness going on up at the applications. So we have this desire to kind of get a handle on it by pulling it down to a common layer. But at the same time, we get better security policy when we have more contextful policy. And I'll dig into what contextual means in just a second. And so this is kind of an essential tension that I see generating some really interesting technology to help resolve. So when I talk about contextful policy, really what I mean is, we want as much data in hand when it comes to make the decision as possible, and we want the right data. And the most basic example is something like basic firewall rules, where the context that we have in hand is a network 5 tuple. Maybe something more contextful is something like an API gateway. And now I'm not talking about IP addresses, but I'm talking about, HTTP methods on endpoints. And I can do network things too, but I've also gained this capability to kind of restrict it at a higher layer. And then we go beyond that. And for example, inside of our applications themselves, we want to do end user to resource access control, right? That's yet again more contextful. because now I need to know not just, what are the systems that are communicating, where do they live on the network, not just what is the action that's happening at the HTTP level, but actually I need to understand, what's the user in context and what is the resource in the system that's being accessed, right? So that's what I mean when I say we want more contextful decisions. And ideally, and to kind of tee off of some of the AI talk, this is where we get really interesting things, right? Things like risk analysis, things like, pulling signal or pulling, data, pulling signal out of things like access data, right? An example I like to give is, if we're doing zero trust and you're doing identity-based access, you want context around that access. Because if I'm on my phone logged in, accessing an internal company website or my email or something like that, I may be accessing, regularly logged in from my regular device that we know because we have a device identity and we have a user identity. And we also have context like location. And I happen to live in the Southeast US. And so I'm accessing from the Southeast US, and that's the regular operations. We may then decide to deny access if I start magically and suddenly accessing from maybe somewhere in Eastern Europe, right? And one of the places where AI is interesting in general is this feedback and getting signal out of the data in our system and then using that to feed runtime systems that act. So we want contextful, but at the same time, we're kind of struggling because we have, for business reasons, we're breaking apart our applications, we're adopting microservices, smaller units of code for a couple of different reasons, but the biggest one being because we want to deliver more features faster to users, right? And so we want to split our teams apart so they can iterate independently of each other, right? And so inherently, it's going to be messy. That's kind of why we're doing it, is to unlock them from each other. Then at the same time, we have this trend in the industry of adopting cloud, adopting these new cloud native technologies and similar. And so that adds yet another layer of complexity on top of an already hard problem that is wrangling how these services are communicating. And so again, that gives this big pull to where do we find the narrow waist, right? How do we kind of get a handle on all this complexity up at the app layer and get consistent security across it, but not lose context, since the whole point is that we want context. We can very easily go to a world where we're doing micro segmentation with network firewalls and things like that, but that's only going to give us so much assurance compared to doing more sophisticated things, right? So how do we get, so as we're adopting, as we're kind of doing this contextual policy, I want to know, how do we get it right at scale, as well as kind of is one of the other key problems, right? So again, we have this dynamism problem that's big. So this tension between common handle on it versus context gives us an interesting kind of infertile technology. Service mesh is one thing that I work on that tries to resolve some of this, and there's other technologies too. So API gateways are another one, and that's even easier. Microsegmentation, we're using the network. That's one common way, so much context. API gateways, even better. Application identity gives us even better, right? And as we go up. One of the examples, so now I want to kind of make this concrete, right? So we have this tension between the two. How do we start to get context into common layers? Pulling things like payload validation. If we look at the OWASP top 10 API vulnerabilities, a lot of them are around payload validation, endpoint validation, and authorization. A lot of those problems are actually cross-cutting. So for example, one of the tools and technologies that exist is something like an open API spec that we can get our applications to tell us what is appropriate for me to receive. What should a payload look like, right? We don't need to necessarily do that validation in the application where we would traditionally do that, right? I would get my request and I would validate it and I would make sure the strings and the numbers are in the right range and the strings aren't too long. And now we can start to migrate that out into an API gateway. or into something like a service mesh or similar. And application developers don't need to think about it. And from a controls perspective, I have a single layer that I can point to and say, I'm doing this security here, and therefore we're safe, right? So that's one way that we're doing things like bringing context down. And this is one that I want to see us, kind of do more and more interesting things on, right? And this is kind of a big area of research for me, is how can we start to do things like understand more of what's going on in the context of the application, but from the outside, and start to apply policy on it. Start to apply things like next generation access control and do fine-grained access, not just of users accessing resources. That's the level that we sit at today. By the way, if you look at the OWASP top 10 for API security vulnerabilities, I think 3 of them are related to not doing just basic resource access correctly. So that's a hard thing to do. We need to get that right. And again, hopefully things like service mesh doing authentication as well across the board can help with some pieces of that. But then we need, again, more context. So we want to start to limit not just end user resource access, but even maybe data in our resource as well. So, I have a employee database, right, an internal directory, and maybe for HR, I have salaries in addition to phone numbers and contact information, right? A manager may be able to see things like salary. HR may be able to see salary, but other employees can't, for example, right? Common problem. This is something that today has to be embedded in our applications. If I wanted to make an access control decision and give a user, I'm going to render a web page that has the employee directory in it. I'm going to make an access decision in that application probably and decide the manager has access, so I'll show the salary field or not. Things like next generation access control and applying that to data in DAC. If you go, there's papers there, if you go Google as well, give us the ability to start to tackle even that level of problem, like really contextful, not even just can you access the resource, but which pieces of the data can you access? We can actually start to evaluate from outside the application. So for example, you could do something like put a really smart proxy in front of a database that can start to do that level of access control over the data that's coming out. And the benefit being your applications can start to be real dumb. Your application can go, hey, give me all the data about the user, and I can just show it on a web page. And as long as we have that correct access control behind it, we're never going to show that salary when we shouldn't, right? So the challenge has always been then how do we get that out of it? How do we not do that bespoke every single time? We're finally starting to see emerging technologies that help address that problem. Next generation access control is one. A service mesh, I work on something called Istio. If people want an example of that, is one way that we are trying to do something like consistent high context policy across the heterogeneous world that is microservices. And I think this is where we're going to see a lot of really interesting stuff in the future as well. So this is where I think this kind of wrangling with this fundamental tension of we have a heterogeneous world. We want high context policy because it gives us a high level of assurance that we're going to keep our data and our user data, whatever it is that we're protecting, safe. But at the same time, we need to wrangle this huge explosion of applications and the highly dynamic environment that we're deploying it in. And so I think that's kind of a really fun set of challenges. And that's kind of where I spent the last about 8 years of my career, especially around that set of challenges. And I think it's a really fascinating and fun area. So with that, I think I'm a little bit shorter on time. I'm happy to dig into a little bit more if we want, or if we want to head on over. Yeah, so somebody mentioned SASE. Yeah, Gartner's been talking about this for a good bit. SASE and CASE are great things. We want to make them a little bit more concrete. I recommend go check out one that I think we did a good job making it concrete is this SB 800-207A. SB 800-207 lays out zero trust. 207 and everybody in the world seemed to have a slightly different opinion on what it is. We can ask Ron what zero trust is, and she can delegate down to we can get the right people. But yeah, thanks. Thank you for posting that again. I apologize, I lost my thread. But 207A starts, so SASE, we gets very practical, right? So we give actually a concrete runtime definition of what zero trust is, because I was tired of kind of the vendor FUD and everybody giving slightly different definitions. And so we try to get something that's actually pretty concrete, right? And we actually give some runtime controls. This is in the control section, so I won't talk too much about it, but we argue if you can do some kind of five basic things: encryption, end user authentication, end user authorization, service authentication or workload authentication, and service auth, lands you at what we would call a zero trust environment. And again, those decisions of how we do that auth and auth on those identities, that's where I think there's some really interesting and evolving technology in our field. And that's where we want those contextual policies that I talked about, right? And yeah, the SASE kind of talks about a big thing. We talk about a much narrower, more focused thing, which is what is the principle of zero trust that you need to achieve. The framing I'll give you in 3 minutes here is that you should assume that, suppose I can pick any workload in your environment and expose it to the public internet. What is your risk profile? And when you can, with a straight face, say that I am not more at risk than if you were on my own network, or if you were on part of my system, you would compromise some workload, then we've achieved kind of a zero trust runtime. So that's the aspirational model to achieve. How do we start to manifest that at runtime? And we argue those 5 controls, which we call identity-based segmentation, help you achieve that, right? And that is one of those things that, for example, the surface mesh technology is one of the ways that you can start to achieve some of those pieces. And again, I think this is where we are going to see more evolution in technology that's driven, right? How can we give infrastructure teams and platform teams that are facilitating thousands of application developers the tools so that they can do the security right for their application, and ideally think about it as little as possible, right? Because very few of us get paid to think about security. Most of us get paid to deliver features for users, right? And so the degree to which we can make it in the security field, we can make it simple for application teams to deliver value, and we can give them a safe platform to move on top of. I think we're doing our job well. And so that's kind of I come from the infrastructure side. And so we've got to get very pragmatic with how we're doing the security pieces. And I see this common layer and this pulling down to common infrastructure is one of the big tools for us to be effective.
Ron, we've set you up for success. They've thrown 50 softballs at you. All you got to do is knock it out of the park. Again, I like to allow people to introduce themselves, but in honor of Memorial Day, if I was in uniform and I had on my sergeant stripes, I would stand and salute Lieutenant Colonel Ron Ross. Thank you for your service in the military. Thank you for your public service for all that you've done at NIST. I will let you take it anywhere that you choose related to the conversation, but thank you so much for being here and contributing to the discussion. I know there's a lot of directions that you can go. Ron, the floor is yours.
What a inspiring discussion this has been today, and the work that you've done and all the people as part of the 502 project. It's just incredibly great work that you guys have done to kind of push the ball forward. I did get dressed up today because it was a holiday, so I wanted to make sure I had my best attire on. I've been doing this a long time, and I was really enjoying listening to Diana and to Zach talking about 2 subjects that are very close to my heart. And sometimes I think everybody on this call can relate to this. You get discouraged over time. There's a lot of difficult and challenging problems that we're faced with every single day. But when I do get discouraged, I come back to sessions like this and I hear the enthusiasm of the people on the call today. And it just kind of renews my confidence that we're going to solve these problems long term. The the first part of the call, I was trying to count how many animals Diana has. I know she has at least a dog and 2 cats from what I counted. There may be more, but anyway, it was good to see. I have a dog sitting right behind me too, Sophie. She's 13 years old and she's a rescue, slowing down a lot, just like me. But you know, I can vouch for AI. I'll just kind of do this stream of consciousness. There's so many things I'd like to talk about, but about 40 years ago, I got a call from the Department of the Army, and they said, would you like to go to get your PhD in artificial intelligence? Because we'd like you to become a program manager for the Army's autonomous vehicle program. So I said, that sounds hard. I don't know if I want to do that, because Kian, you know, in the Army, if they send you to school and you don't pass, your career is pretty much over. So it was, you talked about risk management. This is a high risk operation, you know. So I did go to the Naval Postgraduate School, and you know, a shout out to, there are certain schools that teach you everything from the top of the stack down to the bottom of the stack, you know, from the software, the applications, all the way down to the integrated circuits. And that was the Naval Postgraduate School. It was a fantastic school to learn I call it the fundamentals, the blocking and tackling. And so I spent a lot of years getting my PhD in artificial intelligence and robotics. And the day before I graduated, I got a phone call from the Department of the Army. They said, guess what? The guy that you're replacing has decided not to leave. He's going to extend for a year. So go find yourself another job. So, you know, I called my buddies at the NSA. This was 1990. And I said, hey, do you have any jobs over there for computer scientists? And they said, we got tons of jobs over there. And I use this story when I talk to young people. I know this ties into your whole mission for the channel and all the things you're doing with the program and LLC. It's mentoring the next generation. Everybody on this call knows, you know, all of us are at different ages. I'll be moving, my runway is getting a lot shorter than a lot of the folks on this call. So part of the things I've always wanted to do is mentor the next generation. I've tried to do this my whole career. And I was inspired because when I came to the NSA, I knew nothing about cybersecurity. It wasn't even called cybersecurity back in those days. It was called information security, computer security. And there was an enormous number of people who took me under their arm, under their wing, and just took me in the office for hours and explained everything that I needed to know about starting out in cybersecurity. And I also read every book I could and every paper, seminal papers. And so when I talk to young people today, I said, you know, the one thing I can tell you for sure is there's going to be lots of churn and change and disruption in whatever career you choose. But the one piece of advice I always tell them is get grounded in the fundamentals, invest in the fundamentals. And a lot of people today are, unfortunately, are running away from the STEM sciences and things that are hard. Even if you look at all the computer science courses across the country, they're not all the same. I was surprised when I was at the NSA and I was hiring potential employees there. I would ask a few questions. What kind of courses did you have in your computer science curriculum? Did you have automata theory? Did you have the theory of programming languages? Not just can you program in COBOL or C++ or some of the new languages, but can you tell the difference in what makes certain programming languages better as far as more secure languages? You know, the memory safe languages they're talking about now at DHS, all of those things kind of talk to the core and the fundamentals. And I said, if you get grounded in the fundamentals, no matter what happens to you and what kind of curveball you get thrown in life, you'll always be able to land on your feet, because computer security, information security, cybersecurity, it all builds on a common foundation, either of computer science, electrical engineering, computer science, mathematics. It's all kind of rolling under that foundation. And so that's really what saved me. And so I went there in 1990. I had no idea what I was getting into, but I developed the greatest passion for what now is called cybersecurity. And it just drives me every day. And you know, the thing that's kept me going is that I've been able to witness over the past 40 years the journey that has been driven by the greatest innovation ever on the planet. I remember when I was a plebe at West Point, we were programming in Fortran, and we had to punch cards on a deck of cards, take them to the computer center, put the deck of cards in, and then next day come back and find out you left a comma out of the line of code. You had to go back and do it over again. And so if you can look at the journey from where we've come, where the technology, our industry has been fantastic and just innovating and pushing technology out. And it's left us with these difficult and challenging problems. In fact, the kinetic world out there is so different than cyber. And this is why I think we continue to have challenges in the overall space of cybersecurity. We certainly have a lot of great things going on. Diana talked about, the AI aspects, and Zach talked about all of the things that really do get below the waterline. And when you're talking about, penetration resistance, if that boundary mechanism fails, the adversaries now are deep inside your system. So what Zach was talking about, it's kind of an articulation of what I call the multi-dimension protection strategy. We've relied for 40 years on one dimension, boundary protection. You build the wall as high as you can build it with access controls, identification, authentication, encryption. But we know with a lot of empirical data, we've all seen this either publicly or behind the scenes. If you have a security clearance, you can get some of the really good stuff. We know the adversaries can breach the systems pretty much whenever they want to. At least the good ones can. They've got a lot of talented people. They have time, they have resources, and they are very, very capable adversaries. And so I've tried to describe the world that we're working in now as above the waterline and below the waterline. It's kind of a metaphor. And the above the waterline is where most of us work. Most people work on developing security programs for enterprises. They're buying commercial products, databases, applications. They've got missions to carry out. And so they're going along trying to accomplish the mission. They read about the cyber attacks. They may even get breached, and they're looking at all the vulnerabilities, the known vulnerabilities, wherever they come from. That stack gets bigger and bigger. And unfortunately, as the technology has matured and gone forward, it's given us with this thing called enormous complexity. And everybody on the call here today knows that. It's trillions of lines of code, billions of devices, ubiquitous connectivity across the planet. And all of that complexity equates to attack surface. So on one side, it's a complex system of systems that gives us enormous capability. On the other side of that coin, the adversary looks at it as attack surface. And that gives them almost unlimited potential to attack whenever they want, wherever they want. And that kind of leads us to the discussion going below the waterline. And so below the waterline, there's a literal war going on that most people don't see. It's being fought by adversaries and defenders. It's not visible in a lot of cases, and it does talk to the need for this multi-dimension protection strategy. And that's what spawned some of the things that Zach talked about, zero trust, focusing on architecture and engineering, secure by design, which is, I think, an unfortunate choice of words because, those of you who are in this business any more than 20 or 30 years ago, you remember this term called assurance. We used to talk about functions and assurance. And you can deploy all the security functions on the planet, but if those functions are not built correctly, and you can verify that, and you can validate, are they actually doing what they're supposed to do? We've lost 2 generations of people, students, because we just stopped talking about assurance. If you go back and look at the old Orange Book days, back at the NSA, if you go back and look at the common criteria, assurance is a big deal. It's about functionality and assurance and how those things work together. So that's kind of another story, but unfortunately, our grand strategies, our national strategy has not focused on below the waterline problems for a long, long time. We're starting to get better now. The national strategy, if you were to Google, do a word search in any national strategy, whether it's the moonshot or any one of the ones that have come out in the last 10 years, try to find how many hits you get on the terms systems, security, engineering. I can barely find those words uttered in any of these national strategies. So when the top level leadership is not focused on those kind of things, you end up having a continual discussion about, hey, let's build it in, not bolt it on. How many times have we heard that? Well, those things are idle terms. They don't mean anything because it really takes a concerted effort when you go below the waterline to, first of all, reduce and manage complexity. There's a reason why formal methods can only be applied to a limited set of code or system components. It's just hard to do. you've got to have a faithful interpretation from the source code all the way down to the instructions that are, executing on those computer chips. And that faithful representation has to go through every layer from the top all the way down to the bottom. It's not easy to do. So the multi-dimension protection strategy says, yes, do everything for penetration resistance that you possibly can. But when that fails, what happens then? What happens when the adversary has breached your perimeter? They're operating inside your system. And now what do you do? Well, the second and third dimension talk to what we can do. And the second dimension is something called damage limitation. And that gets exactly to the things that Zach was talking about. When you talk about a system or a system of systems, you can build it out kind of in uniform or heterogeneous fashion, or you can decompose that network and that system into domains. And why would we do that? Because we can't get our arms around all of that complexity. So when you talk about ways to do that, if the adversary gets into your system, there are two kind of, they call it a horizontal and a vertical approach. You can try to limit their lateral movement. And we do that by doing some of the things that Zach talked about. Developing, having network segmentation, micro segmentation. You basically kind of carve out smaller and smaller, I would call them security domains that can be better protected. How? Because you got a smaller piece of real estate and you can apply things like zero trust, the concepts and everything that Zach talked about. And by the way, I agree with those 5 principles that he talked about that are talking about that at the execution level in the next publication that NIST and all of the partners worked on. So that's a really important thing. But zero trust inherently doesn't reduce complexity. It does a good job about applying those 5 or 6 controls in that environment. But it still doesn't handle, unless you apply some of the trust principles in 800-160, which we worked on for a long, long time. We brought 40 years worth of design principles that we've collected over literally 40 years into that publication. So the message here is keep doing the things that Zach was talking about, the microservices. All of that does increase our level of assurance. And so that's the second, the second dimension of damage limitation is to limit the lateral movement by trying to confine the adversary to places where you can have better defenses, smaller, more defensible domains, if you will. The other thing you can do, and that would limit the transit of attacks as well. You can cut that attack chain, that attack vector has lots of different steps to it. Anytime you can intercede yourself at any point, you can stop that attack. The other thing that's important in that damage limitation comes about by the virtual machines and the micro virtualization. When you refresh those components very quickly, and the smaller and smaller pieces that are being refreshed through micro virtualization techniques, that means you're basically starting with a clean slate. And if you can do that very rapidly, just think about combining the segmentation, microsegmentation with virtualization and micro virtualization. And now not only are you limiting the adversary's transitive movement, but you're also limiting the time on target. And that's what the adversaries desperately need. They need time on target. So one of our other documents, besides 800-160 Volume 1, which talks about life cycle security. How do you build those security concepts into the life cycle? And we'll talk just a little bit about that in a minute. But the second volume is on cyber resilience. And that really talks to these dimensions of security across those 3 dimensions. Stop them at the boundary if you can. Can't do that. Limit the damage they can do. And then that leads to the third dimension, which is kind of an articulation of the first and the second dimensions called cyber resilience, or I like to generalize that to something called system resilience. And what that means basically is in this chaotic world that we're building of these massively complex systems, can you do everything you can by good engineering and architecture to be able to have an adversary attack you, penetrate the system, and still carry out your mission, even if it's in a degraded or debilitated state? And Kian, from your time in the military, that's how the military rolls. That's how the Army rolls. If the lieutenant gets hit, the sergeant steps into the breach, takes command of that platoon or that company. And so we have to have, in the world of kinetic space, everything is kind of in your face. You know, we all remember on 9/11 where we were. We could watch the towers coming down, the Pentagon was hit. And that's a kinetic image. But in the world of cyber, it's kind of like having cancer. You know, cancer starts with one cell and then it multiplies very quickly until it attacks the organs. And as someone who's gone through that, I can tell you, I was walking around just feeling perfectly fine until I started getting the test back. And then, you know, that one thing leads to another. And thank goodness every day that I'm still here. But it's that below the water line. It's the cancer-like things that are going on that, you know, everybody's got the lights on, you know, your pacemaker's still working, you're watching Netflix, everything seems to be good until it's not. And the world, and you talked about infrastructure, the world we're building, think about this. All of this complexity and all this great technology, we're pushing into everything that matters with the term, I call it cyber physical convergence. It's everything from the 100 computers in your automobile that are all driven by untrustworthy software and firmware, controlling your entertainment system and your braking system. And we know full well the adversaries, they're deep into our supply chain. They not only, they're not stopping at just breaching your system. They want to get into the source of where that code's being developed. And you're talking about DevOps and DevSecOps. I'll tell you, it's a complicated problem because we've got all of this energy of our software developers trying to bring capability and functionality to customers. And most of these systems are delivered wide open. For example, IPv6 delivered wide open on systems. The adversaries know that. Most people are still using IPv4. So the adversaries have a protocol now that's open, and they can use that to gain credentials and then do privilege escalation. And now they got control of the whole system. So little things that we've known for 40 years that are actually 4 words: least functionality, least privilege. They sound easy to do. But if we would do nothing more than those 2 things, we would stop about 90% of these cyber attacks from being successful. Now, the rest of the 10%, we need the second and third dimension and things like that. And so when you talk about the term, we also like buzzwords, secure by design. We didn't use that term in 800/160. Why? Because it's impossible. Every computer scientist knows the limits of complexity theory and the limits of what we can do because of complexity. That's what automata theory was all about for the computer scientists out there. It's bringing the mathematical basis to computer security. It defines the limits of what's possible. We've so far outstripped that we are running in uncharted territory now. So in my view, and this is the difficult part, we know how to build trusted systems. We don't know how to build fully secure systems because the complexity is to the point where it's an impossible task. So the only thing we're left with are degrees of trustworthiness. And so this is what brings me to my final point about our work with NASA and with DoD. You know, for the past 20 years, we've developed a lot of frameworks. We have the cybersecurity framework, we have the privacy framework, we have the risk management framework, we got controls coming out the kazoo. We got it all. But all of that stuff is deployed mostly above the waterline. If I were to ask you, most people look at these computers, the laptops, the notebooks, the tablets, the smartphones, they're black boxes. They love to use them, but the extent of what they know stops at the user interface. We shouldn't expect our consumers to know what goes on inside the black box. That's Zach's job. He knows how to do that. He knows where the problems are, and he's working on fixes. But it's going to take a while to get to the point where all of that stuff that he talked about can come together, because it's a big, big task. So what do we do until that time? It's a black box. We blindly put trust in these black boxes. The cyber physical convergence I talked about, whether it's automobiles or PLCs in a power plant or a pacemaker with wireless access, we basically know nothing about what's inside the black box, but we still buy it and we still use it. So that gets to the old blue screen of death. Ken, you've got enough gray hair in that beard to understand the blue screen of death. But a lot of young people out there may not remember that term. But when that happened, your computer would basically crap out and you see a blue screen. That means there was a terminal error there, but typically nobody died. But today, when you have massive cyber physical convergence, and those computers are everywhere and everything that matters, and they're being driven by that same untrustworthy software and firmware, we're basically holding our breath till the lights go out or till my pacemaker stops or till I'm driving down the beltway at 70 miles an hour, I tap my brakes and nothing's happening. So how do we get out of this box? Well, this is why we're putting a focus on assurance. And Gene Spafford just posted something recently. He's now been given just a great opportunity to work with Sandia National Labs, resurfacing this whole notion of assurance. How do we build systems that are going into our critical infrastructure that have to be bulletproof? You know, it may not be something we can, we don't need operating systems with 100 million lines of code because it's loaded up with all these applications that I don't need. At NSA, we used to have a term I called the trusted garage door opener. It was a little device. It had very little code and it did one thing. It could open up your garage door and close it. It didn't do anything else, but it could do it with high assurance. I didn't have to worry about it. We've got to get back to, and this started out with the thin client kind of methodology where we would build a thin client. It didn't have a lot of capability, but we certainly could put a lot more trust in that. There are only degrees of trustworthiness when you're building a system. And this is why we're working with NASA now and with DoD. And we're working with systems engineers. For the last 40 years, cybersecurity has been its own deal. We've all worshiped that we're the most important people in the conversation, and it's all about us. But in reality, when you talk to systems engineers, they only care about one thing. They've got a mission to carry out, and they got to be able to put steel on target, whether it's a new weapon system or NASA's building a satellite in contested cyberspace. So they have to go through the trade space discussion. You could roll in the door with 100 security controls and say, hey, this is what the CIA wants me to do under FISMA. And they're going to look at you and say, what? I've got to go through the life cycle. I've got to talk about my system requirements first. What's the capability that the system has to execute and bring to the table? And then I may have to trade some things off. I might not be able to encrypt that uplink because encryption takes too long. And if I encrypt the stuff, I'm not going to be able to put steel on target. So these are the kinds of decisions that when we're talking to engineers now, and it's the most fascinating thing ever. You've got security engineers coming into the system engineers world and saying, basically, this is your ball game. We're here to support you. We're not here to be on top of this. It's not all about us. And so there's very interesting things going on, which Key and you would love. There's communication. Security engineers have to learn a new language of system engineers. System engineers have to learn more about security. And nobody walks away with all the marbles. It's about trade space. It's about decisions. It's about cost, schedule, performance. But the good news is we're going in with our eyes wide open, and the engineers are learning a lot of things that they never anticipated that the security folks are bringing to the table, especially with some of the new threats that we see out there. So out of this wonderful experiment that we're doing with NASA, DoD will be involved, a lot of military services, because they have a critical problem with deploying technologies that adversaries now can bring down. And if that's a satellite system where the DoD or somebody's relying on that for either military purposes or commercial purposes, that's command and control, baby. That's the whole ball of wax. The next war is not going to be fought on the kinetic battlefield. It'll never get that far because the adversaries will be able to defeat us well before we can even get out to where the kinetic space starts. And that's the message that has been very hard to talk about because it's that cancer. I got it, but I don't feel bad yet. And that's a mental state that we all have that we have to really try to get ahead of. And this is why I love what you're doing, because it's all about the essential partnership. And this will be about my closing story here. President Kennedy, back in 1961, which again, I know a lot of people will not remember, but we were in an existential missile race with the old Soviet Union. And he came on and gave a very famous speech in 1961. And he said to the nation, he said, we're going to go to the moon by the end of this decade, not because it is easy, but because it is hard. the quote was probably a little bit more extensive, but that's the gist of it. 8 years later, in 1969, July the 20th, I'll never forget that day. I'd been at West Point for 20 days. They marched all 4,400 cadets into a big auditorium, and we watched the first moon landing. This is amazing with 1950s and 1960s computing technology. But what do we have? We had the essential partnership, government, industry, and academia working together on an existential threat, an existential challenge. And just like everything else in America, we figure it out because we got great people. We just bring it when we have to. So now the question is, that was an existential kinetic threat. What do we do now when we have the existential cyber threat? The difference is you can't see it. You can see the Soviet missiles being built. We knew what they could do. And so now, how do we get the country focused on these difficult and challenging problems and be able to bring the A game, going into the universities, encouraging people to take the hard courses, take the engineering courses, take the mathematics courses. We got quantum crypto. We need people that understand the fundamentals, the blocking and tackling. But we also need people that can write a policy, and that can be CISOs and CIOs. The message here is in cybersecurity, there's something for everybody, and it's exciting. And with that, I think I'll stop and I'll turn the rest of my time back to you and maybe answer some questions later. But thanks again for inviting me, Kean. I always love doing this.
Ron, it's always a blast to have you at the party. I hope that this knocked everybody else's socks off. I've had the pleasure and the privilege of being friends with Ron for a long time. And these are the things that we talk about over coffee in the background. As we transition from what Ron said into what Shannon has to say, one of the things that I highlight for the audience is, because it is impossible to build secure systems, business leaders must be educated enough to establish the minimum degree of trustworthiness that they are willing to accept as they use technology in pursuit of their business objectives. And so as Shannon is preparing her thoughts, her heart, and her mind to come forward, one of the specific reasons that I invited her to be part of this conversation is that everything that Diana and Zach and Ron talked about is important, but none of it happens if we don't have buy-in from business people. And Shannon is possibly the one person that I know that spends more time with CFOs without being a CFO herself. And she has the ability to provide some insight about what these conversations sound like when you're talking to financial people, when you're talking to business executives, when you have things that I won't call insane, like Sarbanes-Oxley, that drive very prescriptive outcomes, neglecting everything else. And so, Shannon, again, I've thrown you a softball. You have the floor. I look forward to you knocking it out of the park.
I don't know about everybody else on this call, but I have been taking notes this whole time because I'm learning as I'm hearing all of my counterparts. So I do appreciate everyone's time today because I've learned a few new things today. As Keon said, I work with many organizations helping implement security and compliance solutions in helping to negotiate terms, I guess you could say. It might be one of the ways to do it. And when I negotiate terms, I negotiate not only with the business side, but I'm also negotiating with the application side, the infrastructure side, the security side. So I'm the person that has to interpret it, as I think Ron said it, even Zach and Diana even said it. I have to interpret everyone's language and bring it to the forefront of all the different industries. So, but for a quick background, I actually had a dream one day to be a CFO, and that's not what happened. So I actually started my career as an accountant and operational individual. I worked in internal audit departments, and somehow through my wanting to get more involved in IT and exposure in the other half of the world, I became an IT auditor, which led me to going and running a compliance department over time at a small startup called Silence, where I had to work with quite a few individuals, data scientists, and others to interpret and make sure they were doing their thing. So as I say, I landed in cybersecurity through duct tape and glue, and I just got stuck to the wall and I can't seem to get off, but I enjoy it thoroughly. So as Keon said, one of the big things I do is I help individuals like CISOs and security individuals, infrastructure teams, explain why they need to do what they need to do, right? It is not easy doing their job. It's not understood, and it's very theoretical, right? Well, this could potentially happen. And if this happens, then we're going to have this, this, and this, right? So if someone comes in and does ransomware, they're going to lock up all our data and we're going to have to make a big payment. Well, is it really going to happen? Is it not going to happen? What's the real risk here? Right? So how do you convince somebody that this is a true risk when it hasn't happened in their environment yet? They haven't seen it occur. And the likelihood of it happening to them, maybe, maybe not, right? So and to be honest with all of everyone, most people don't actually know truly how many companies have had ransomware attacks happen, have had malware, because most of it's hidden and swept under the rugs. It is not on the Wall Street Journal. It is not known to the world, right? They actually hide it. So statistically, we can't even get a full understanding of what the true impact is to a business. So that theoretical theory only becomes a problem because we don't truly know the numbers, right? But what happens in the industry here is you've got these great individuals, they're all having conversations and back conversations saying, oh, wait a second, this is happening over here. How do I address it? And all of a sudden they're talking to the company that's being impacted that can't tell officially what's happening. We can say, hey, you need to look out for X, Y, and Z. And now they're going to figure out how to fix it on the back channels. That's not what we want to do. We want to work with individuals and get them to understand the communication. So I work with CFOs, I work with COOs, and I try to help them understand what's the business reason. But then I also reverse engineer that, and I work with the CISOs and the security individuals, and I teach them and explain to them what's the revenue purpose, what's driving revenue. How can I take what they do every day and make it a revenue generating tool? So then it interprets the business language. How can I prove that what they're doing is for a good cause, right? And a lot of that, it tends to be led into how I implement compliance within organizations, right? So as you heard Ron say, there's all the different NIST frameworks. There's other frameworks that all meet certain regulatory requirements. So you have the HIPAA high-tech regulatory requirements all around your protected healthcare information. You have all of your privacy regulatory requirements, which requires you to meet certain requirements in securing data around personal data, right? Then you have your PCI requirements that's all about protecting credit card data. And then, as Keon said, it's my favorite topic these days, is the regulatory requirements that the SEC has all around the control frameworks in Sarbanes-Oxley. And if most of you don't know about Sarbanes-Oxley, I'm not sure, again, it kind of is that age factor. Sarbanes-Oxley came around because of these fabulous companies called like Enron and WorldCom that decided to circumvent and do fraudulent activities and hide it and bury it in their balance sheets and their GL and merger acquisitions, as well as in their technology, so that when they bellied up as companies because they were hiding all of their fraudulent activities, all of a sudden the SEC came down and said, you now need to meet certain requirements. One of them is what they call the SEC 404, which is control validation and testing of your environments. The other big thing they did was hold the C-suite, specifically the CEO and the CFO, accountable. And if any fraudulent activities happen, those two individuals sign off on the financials and the SOX testing every year, and they could go to jail. So they then took that big piece of information and they held someone accountable. So as Ron said, the word assurance has disappeared in the world. It has not disappeared over in the cybersecurity world of accounting and all the requirements around accounting. The words I use every single day is reasonable assurance. How can we get reasonable assurance? How can we ensure there's assurance that this is working effectively? And what can we do? I'm working with individuals to make sure that all of those control frameworks that Ron, Zach, and Diana talked about of where we need to prove and show and get the evidence and get all of the work done is actually being executed. I'm working with the teams like the infrastructure teams to prove out that they did the changes that were expected in the environment, and that they have evidence of the testing, and that there isn't anything inappropriate happening. But the limits with Sarbanes-Oxley is it's all about financial data. So if you've noticed, I just talked about all of the requirements, and it's boxing the requirements based off of specific types of data set. And federal too has that same situation where their data set is very specific, and it's all around, I know I'm about to say it, Keon, because I can't remember it, but it's CUI data. So controlled unclassified information. I know I'm not allowed to say acronyms, but sometimes that's all you can remember. So, but federal data also is supposed to be protected based off of the regulations of DFARS and FARS, which is then has your frameworks and your requirements around CMMC and FedRAMP. And I apologize, Keon, but I'm not going to remember all of them right now. So, but that, as I say that, guys, that's loaded. I just gave you a loaded bunch of all the different requirements, all the data security that goes into place, and all the needs. So all the work that individuals like Ron, Diana, and Zach have done in trying to train, inform, they've helped build these frameworks, these guidelines, these ways to get organizations, whether it's public or private, to follow some path to get to a security point. But how do you follow that path if you don't have the money to do it? How do you ensure you get to the finish line if you don't have the people and resources because you don't have the budget to bring another person on, right? A lot of times they're doing it through duct tape and glue. They are trying their hardest by automating as much as they can, hiring out third-party resources, or just doing the best they can with what resources they have. And that's where I come in. And that's where teams like me are needed, because we need to work with these individuals to help them message it properly, talk to these individuals, bring it up to the board level to understand what the true risks are, but also not really being afraid to say it, right? Because some people are truly afraid to say what the risks are in the organizations. One, for fear of losing their job, because then they're going to ask you, why didn't you fix it? But two, now they're going to have extra work with no resources, and they don't know how to handle those components, right? And so it's really important to figure out and work with your business individuals to help them communicate that language. One of the things that is coming out, good, bad, or ugly, most people are not going to love it initially, is the SEC did just come out with a new requirement around the filings of breaches in the environment, as well as things around third-party vendor management. That's going to change the scope of what's going to come into scope for an environment. So when you talk about Sarbanes-Oxley, it's all about your financial data. And when I say financial data, I'm talking about revenue, cost of goods sold, inventory, all of the money. I'm not talking about the behind the scenes stuff like customer data or the product itself per se. I'm talking about the systems that have the money that goes all the way around. So what they call your enterprise risk, ERP, I'm going to say enterprise risk assessment. That's totally not the word, but your application that manages your GL, I'm doing it again, Keon. I'm so sorry. I'm the worst with acronyms, everybody. But your systems that manage all your accounting, right? Your systems that process invoices, your systems that manage your cost, your systems that manages the commissions, the payroll, all of those systems is what they really truly look at. And when you define the scope for SOX, you're looking at what the flow of dollars and cents is, and where are you recognizing revenue and how you're getting to the finish line, right? But when the SEC sat there and said, hey, you got to now show every breach, they didn't say the breach for financial data. They said the breach for everything in the company that has a material impact. And the definition of material impact in the Sarbanes-Oxley world versus the security worlds is actually two completely definitions. And they have not come to a compromise on what that means. In the financial world, material weakness or material impact is related to dollars. So when I mean that is if you're $100 billion company, and I'm going to give a big number, materiality threshold is $100 million. Nothing is in scope below the $100 million threshold. Everything is in scope above it. So when it comes to security risk and defining what materiality is, if you haven't put what the value of data is in your environment, your customer data, your production data, your data set. So Diana said it, right? She's all about using production data in the test environment and, you know, getting those AI bots learning, right? Same with Zach was saying that, you know, we got to get these environments up and running and we need to use real data, not the fake data. No one's putting a dollar value on what that data means. How much does it cost? Why? Because it doesn't have a dollar value because it's not associated to an invoice, right? The invoice is the dollar value. So if you don't have that associated dollar value, what does that mean to you as an organization? Well, that's going to be defined in the next few years because as they see more breaches and they see more filings, right? The whole new thing just came out. Every company now is filing almost every single breach because they don't know what the material impact is of those breaches. So the SEC came back and said, well, you don't have to file every single thing here. You can file it on this other form. And then when it becomes material, you can file back on the other form, but still tell us everything. At some point, you're going to have to prove you don't have breaches or that those breaches don't have a material impact. And that's when all of these fun things and these controls are going to start coming into place for SOX. And it's going to change the landscape because now the CFO, as I told you, will go to jail if there's a fraudulent activity. He's now going to be held accountable for this materiality weakness. If a materiality weakness happens because there is a ransomware attack and they failed a control correlated to this. And what does that mean? That's going to be a fascinating story. That's why you're starting to see all of a sudden CISOs being held accountable for stuff. And they have never been in the forefront. All of a sudden, they have a seat at the table. I don't know if anyone really truly understands this. The SEC just put the CISO at the table. They made them accountable. They made them now a person just as big as the CEO and the CFO. And when they started charging the CISOs like at SolarWinds and other locations, they truly are starting to prove to you they have a seat at the table. So what does that mean? That means they're now accountable and they shouldn't be signing off on anything without validation that they've got the right resources in place and they've got the ability to put the right controls in place and train the teams and get all of the different aspects on it. And so the landscape's going to start evolving and changing again because now application security is a very high big thing on Sarbanes-Oxley. That's going to start driving down into the other environments, right? I have to make sure that all the application controls are in place. Least privilege. I have to make sure changes to the environment have been proved and have not have any fraudulent activities. I have to make sure the application is working effectively. And if there is a failure, how is it back up and running? I have to make sure if there was somebody that had access to the environment that was inappropriate, that they haven't done anything inappropriate to the financials and they have to do log reviews. Could you imagine if we had to do that in every aspect of the environment? Every single aspect of the environment. Right? Not just the little pieces that I'm talking about. It would change the landscape because now it's going to give the teams the ability and the support to say, I've got a better way to do this. Let's get out of this. Let's do this new way of new energy, new wave, and let's enhance the environment. Let's improve it. Let's do something that gets, as Warren kept saying, below the waterline to make it better, to make it more secure, right? Because that's the outcome that needs to happen is all of these teams, including the business, needs to truly understand the underlying piece of it, that they need to all come together and really understand that this is a bigger impact than just the area that they're focused on. And the how to do that is really kind of, I should say, making one language instead of 4 or 5 different languages across the different organizations, having the understanding of what is a risk in one department is similar risk in the other department. And when I say that, that's actually not a joke, everybody on the call. Risks are looked at differently by departments. So in the financial world, they look at financial risks. In the COO world, he looks at it from an operational standpoint risk. And in IT and security, they look at it from their risk. How do you bring that all together so that the company has an understanding on totality of all of their risks? And how do you do it in a way that gets results and gets real, true prioritizations on what needs to be fixed, right? It's looking at your vulnerability scans and prioritizing. risks does not mean it may be a real high risk. It might be a high risk you can't get to. Let's work on it down the road, but we've got it on the list. But my low risk, which is truly actually probably a high risk because you can get to it. And it's a backdoor that all of a sudden someone can circumvent and get into the environment. They're not working on that one. They're working on the high risk because someone told them that was the priority. And they're not reassessing and saying, what are my true risks? Because someone saw red, someone saw high, and that's all they understood. They didn't truly understand the landscape and the impact. And so those are the things that is also working on evolving and teaching people that, you know, just because in one world you see high risk is a big thing, in another world, actually the low risk might be your urgent matter because it's an open door to the external parties. All right. I like to tell people this. So some people don't know this, some people do, but I've worked at many organizations. And one of the things I love doing is merger and acquisitions. I like working and seeing compliance from two sides of the world. So when you do a merger and acquisition, you start merging environments. And as part of merging environments, you start seeing other companies' weaknesses, right? Some individuals may or may not know this, but Marriott was known for a big hack. I don't even know how many years ago, but a few years ago. Their hack wasn't because of Marriott. It was because of the acquisition of Sheraton. And Sheraton had the weakness, but they didn't do a proper security assessment as they merged environments. So when they merged environments, the issue that was going on in Sheraton now circumvented and went right over into Marriott. So as Ron was talking about zero trust, they took the zero trust away and they combined two environments. Now every aspect of a risk in one environment went to the other. I do that in companies now, and I'm probably not everyone's favorite person because I'm always the person that says you can't merge that. Have you done this? Did you scan it? Did you make sure there's no generic IDs? Did you make sure the ports aren't open? Did you make sure someone can't go into a facility and plug in and get into the environment? Did you make sure that you did a pen test on the outside environment, that someone can't just get into the Wi-Fi and all of a sudden circumvent the environment? Have you done a validation on the physical security? Have you done a validation that people can't break into the door? And have you scanned it to make sure that there isn't vulnerabilities in the environment? Have you taken your tools and scanned it? Are you making sure that they're acceptable to your standards? And it's amazing how many companies do not do it because the CFO and the CEO are driving, and the CEO are driving a merger to remove overhead cost, and they're merging as much data and information and systems into one environment as quickly as possible because they want to remove the overhead costs in the other environment. So that's why you hear about the layoffs and the data mergers, but no one's talking about the big risk that comes with that. And that is a huge component of learning how to speak to those individuals to tell them, slow down and make sure you're assessing it properly. It's also about understanding what tools are there to make sure the environment is secure. And it's also not being afraid as the CISO, as the security lead, to raise your hand and say, there is a problem here. And this is what I found. I have been the person that has stopped multiple mergers from merging environments because I found an issue while I was doing a compliance check. I have been the person that has prevented a go live of applications because they were not ready for it. And that's a really hard conversation to have, right? And Ron said it. You have to be always enthusiastic. You have to be positive. I show up to a table every single day, smiling, telling them how great the day is, the sun is shining, that I might have a bowl of ice cream later for my stress to keep me happy. But I am always trying to find a way to stay positive because I share news that isn't always good. I'm the person that comes in and sits there and tells people something's missing, something's wrong, something has to be improved. And these are the steps that you have to do it, right? I'm the person that Zach calls and says, Shannon, this is going on. How can we get this message forward? And I'm the person that brings the people to the table to say, let's fix this. We have these problems, right? And I build that into it. But then I work with the teams to build into their job the security component, right? That was one of my big things is as an individual, I built the security elements into everyone's job description. DevSecOps, I built it into their job description. I built it into the developers. I built it into the HR team. I built it into it because instead of them having it as a separate thing and, oh my gosh, it's an audit issue or it's something I've got to do down the road, it was something that was part of their day-to-day job. It was their job description. So they didn't just have to do payroll, but they had to make sure that they had steps to follow to make sure payroll was done properly in a secure manner. It wasn't making sure DevOps wasn't just doing and checking in code. They were making sure the security pieces were also done as part of it, right? So it's, in essence, is I could keep going on. So I don't know if my time's up, but like I could keep going on this topic because I'm so passionate about making sure people understand what's needed to get done, how to get to the right finish line, and then always keeping a positive face about it. Because some of these messages, and I'm sure everyone on this call has seen it, sometimes it's not pretty over here. But we have a job that really needs to get done and it's really important and it's needed by the business and they need resources like us to help them get to the finish line. And at the finish line, you climb that summit, it's hard, but when you get to that finish line and you truly know something was successful and everyone came together as a team, it is one of the most like invigorating pieces of my job. Like I just know something great happened here, but along the way, I also helped change the mentality of an organization. I helped them understand the needs and the wants, right? I may have stopped something, but at the end of the day, they thanked me because they saw, wait a second, I would have broken my termination process and I would have had unauthorized users in my environment for who knows how long because I broke down the automation process to remove all users immediately. Do you know how much work it takes to remove a user in an environment? If you have to create a ticket and go in and remove it versus just an HR system removing it automatically when they're termed, it is hours of work. And if you don't know that that's broken, that's a big deal in a company. And now it's wide open. So, but yeah, so for my thing, right? I hope I got to the point, Keon, of where you wanted me to go to, but I love my job. I love what I do. I love working with all these technologists and I love interpreting what they want to say and they need to say to the business to get the business to understand why they're revenue generating, why they have a meaning to the company and what they can do to make them better. Whatever it is and make them successful. And that's what we have to do as an individuals is what makes a company successful and how do they get to the finish line? So.
I'm going to focus on the question that Raphael posted. And so his question was, do you have an action plan that addresses the integration of all major issues and complex ecosystems? And I'm going to leave out his merger and acquisition question so that all of our panelists can focus on what is your recommendation in 60 seconds or less to address the integration of major issues and complexity across ecosystems that exist in a company. And then Raphael will just say that it applies to mergers and acquisitions as well, because when you merge, you make it worse. And then Diana, you get the floor first, and then Zach, and then Ron, and then we'll circle around to Shannon. And I'll try to squeeze in a couple more questions before we exhaust our time.
So yeah, so I know it was around M&A, but I mean, I look at risk holistically across the entire organization, right? You have to take any organization, any entity is a series of complex interdependent systems, and there can be a butterfly effect. So the way to, as you look at it, is to understand if you make this decision to communicate to the business, some other thing may break. Shannon brought up moving too fast, right? And that's something the businesses always wants to do, right? Everybody wants to be Mark Zuckerberg, move fast and break things. Breaking things in cybersecurity and any area actually can be really damaging to the organization. So explaining to them that moving fast here may actually, increase risk or damage to the company in a perhaps unknown or unintended way. So I think it's really about looking across the entire organization, the interdependencies, and helping the business understand what this decision may impact down the line in these other related areas.
Zach?
Yeah, I think there's a couple different angles here. So from like an IT perspective, what's an action plan? Actually, I would recommend the NIST cybersecurity framework as a general place to start, right? And they define kind of 6 overall activities: identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. That's what everybody's known. And then they've added govern finally as well. That's a general pattern. Do the like that we need to execute across our environments, right? So know what we have before we even, before we can even get into anything else. I mentioned earlier, and I know, Shannon, you talked about the risk-oriented language. Ron, you talked about assurance. That's key. So how do you convince the C-level staff to do this? That's why we need the understanding of risk and risk-oriented language in our organization. And it's important to know exactly like Shannon pointed out, different people have different views on risk. And that's why it's important to get a shared language across the organization of what is organizational risk. Maybe departments can have different views, but as an organization, we need to understand. This thought. Somebody asked about like the False Claims Act. I would say that falls under the same kind of a larger umbrella, right? Of we need to understand what is risky for our organization or not, and agree on that holistically. And then you should be able to use that language to then advocate for the execution of those things, right? Because then you have a shared understanding of the cost if you don't, right? Is a strong motivator, but equally you want to build out kind of benefit if you do, right?
Ron?
Yeah, I would say looking at this thing from producers and consumers. So I think on the consumer side, if you're in an enterprise, job number one is to do what the other 2 panelists talked about. Get a good framework. There's lots of them out there, and execute the framework so it actually does something within your organization. We talked about 3 dimensions: penetration, resistance, blocking, and tackling. Even though we say it all the time, there's a lot of evidence that people are not doing the basics. That's job number 1. Number 2, on the consumer side, start to go below the waterline. Do some experiments in the organization. You can't put zero trust everywhere all the time. Carve out a part of your organization, commit to it. Show the management, the senior leaders that you've done this, it's cost you this much, and here's the benefit. So small successes will breed larger successes. That's 2 things. On the producer side, also working below the waterline. Care about your customers. Don't just shove all this stuff out to them and expect them to put these overly bloated, complex systems in the things they care about. Take a page book out of the food industry or the medical industry, where, for stuff I have to take, medicines, I know exactly what's in there. There's a formulary. I can walk down the aisle in the supermarket and see how much cholesterol and how much salt and sugar. That's the SBOM work. Be transparent in how you develop the software, the systems, and the firmware, so your customers can have something to make decisions. Either I'm going to use it, or it's just too darn risky for what the application is asking me to do. And then the last piece with this would be the governance. Not the producer, the consumer. This is the overarching folks who are at the government level. Give us a national strategy that talks about things above the waterline and below the waterline. Take a page out of history. Look at what President Kennedy did back in 1961. Look at this as an existential cyber threat. I'm sure they know that, but just talking about it and not providing leadership so it can be executed downstream, which means going to industry and having expectations on what we expect when you're producing hardware, software, and firmware that's going into these customers' critical systems. That's what I would do. It's not easy, but we got to start somewhere.
And Shannon?
I find an advocate, right? When it comes to this, I always find someone within the company that can support me and help drive the message with me. And we do it as a team. Also, don't be afraid to give the bad news, right? Sometimes you have to stand up and say something is not right. It doesn't smell right, so that you can come as a team to come and fix it, right? You don't go in at it alone. Find the people that can support you and help you as an individual. It's better as a team. It's better to have the message together, because then you can really make it work, right? And those teams need it. And sometimes they're not talking to the C-suite to say, these are the things that have to happen. Everyone's so worried about meeting a deadline versus saying, this is not possible. This is not something. They're worried about losing their bonus. They're worried about what's going to impact their day-to-day job, getting a bad review. Well, sometimes you need to go check on those people and say, what's the true impact? And then work as a team to get back to those individuals, say, we need more time. We need to slow this. We need to do things as a team to do it the right way. And that's not easy. So finding the right advocate and the individuals to support your message is tremendous doing.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're very close to the end, and I have been biting my tongue for 2 hours. So I'm going to give a brief teaching moment before we close. I'll give the closing argument and let you know the next steps. Part of my excitement for this conversation is that I believe the recipients of the message, whether you participated live, and thank you for spending your Friday with us, or whether you're listening to the recording later, everybody learned something from the panelists. And so formally, I thank the panelists for the preparation that you did in advance and for what you brought to the table. For the audience, we did not rehearse this. I had no idea what anybody was going to say, because it's easy to trust people who know what they're talking about when they prepare in advance and they know the context and they just say what they have to say. And so I will say on behalf of the audience that this was great. I took notes, and it's always fun to live tweet 50 links in the middle of a panel discussion. The thing that I'll add for the audience and for the panelists is from a unique perspective, because more than 50% of my time is spent with board directors and C-suite executives. I ran security programs for the CDC in the past, but most of the people that I normally talk to are not IT or security people. Most of those people are business people. That's what inspired me to invite Shannon, because I know she spends a lot of time with business people as well. From a business school perspective, one of the primary responsibilities of the board of directors or the CEO or the owner, if you don't have a board and it's not a public or a private company with a board, is oversight of risk. And what I encourage the audience to consider is that risk is not exclusively security. This series is called The Future of Cybersecurity. And then we had a topic about technology, and we talked about controls last month and the profession the month before. But as you go out and you have conversations about what we discussed and you work to implement everything that we're talking about in your organization, it does become very valuable to understand where business people are coming from based on what they learned in school. And I posted it in the chat. My graduate degree is in business, even though I'm a security person. So I have an MBA, and I took all the classes that the CFO and the CEO are going to take. There is no cybersecurity training for business people in business school who get a business degree. But the flip side is that there is no business training really when you get into the brass tacks for cybersecurity people who get masters in computer science. And so I almost did 2 degrees. I have an MBA. I almost did a master's in computer science. First order logic and reverse malware analysis made my head hurt. But if you look at any of the NSA certified schools that are listed as centers for excellence, none of those graduate programs, with the exception of one that I know of, has any business context in there. And so my gift to you as we get to the finish line is that the board of directors or the business leaders in an organization have fiduciary responsibilities that require, legally enforced, that those people focus on preventing harm to others and working on behalf of the organization and putting the company's interest above their interests. If we focus specifically on the duty of care as a fiduciary responsibility for business people, the duty of care has a legal requirement for people who are subject to that duty to be responsible to prevent harm to others. And so if you take the concept of the duty of care and you apply it to enterprise risk analysis, then the duty of care drives risk managers to do analysis that considers the interest of everybody who's going to be harmed by the risk, which then drives response. It requires that the people who have the duty of care work to respond to risk by reducing it to a level that doesn't require remedy to any party. And remedy to any party means that you're not setting your company up to be sued in court or subject to a class action lawsuit or any other action that causes you to be found liable, where you provide a remedy financially or in some other format to the people who filed the claim because you didn't honor your duty of care. And the other idea is that the safeguard must not be more burdensome than the risk that you're protecting against. And so if you were following along in my live tweeting in the chat, one of the things that I mentioned was that the business has an obligation to define risk appetite. Financial institutions are the most mature at formally documenting a risk appetite statement, but the context of risk appetite includes risk capacity and risk tolerance, where capacity is the maximum amount of risk that you can accept in pursuit of business objectives before you hit the existential threat that Ron talked about. And then risk tolerance is the amount of risk that you're willing to accept, knowing that there's a negative consequence, because the perceived positive consequence is greater than the perceived negative consequence. And so I strongly encourage everybody, as we have this conversation about the future of cybersecurity technology, that you also apply some consideration to business people who are taught in a specific way to evaluate risk, where risk is a measure of uncertainty, and think about, how am I going to present cybersecurity risk in a way that allows the business to say, hey, I'm the chair of the board of directors, I'm ultimately responsible for this, and what are we going to do to consider how people are going to be harmed, and what safeguards need to be put in place to reduce that harm to an acceptable level, so that you are not United Health Group. Because if we apply everything that I just said to United Health Group and the cyber incident that they had in February, their issue was that they didn't have multi-factor authentication for remote access. The outcome of that oversight is that 112 million people in the United States had their protected health information exposed. So it has nothing to do with HIPAA, which applies, and it has nothing to do with high trust, which applies. For the 24 class action lawsuits that were filed, United Health Group is probably going to be found liable because there is a duty of care that is a defined standard that they did not meet. Even if you throw all the regulations away, it is a known thing that you do multi-factor authentication for remote access, and a competent person, given the same resources for the size of the organization and the data that was exposed, would have said, I should do multi-factor authentication. Because if Twitter had to do it because President Obama was compromised, surely United Healthcare would do multi-factor authentication for remote access. And so the closing argument, one, thank you to the panelists. I thought this was awesome. I'm going to have a blast editing this because I have the privilege of editing and posting. For the audience, thank you for spending the Friday before a holiday with us. You could have been sitting in traffic for the next 3 hours on your way to the beach instead of sitting in front of your computer for these 2 hours, partying with us. And, God bless you guys as you work to go implement this in your organizations. But don't forget about the business people, because legally they are accountable. Operationally, they have the budget and they make all the decisions. And I encourage CISOs who are on the call, don't be a superhero, because it would be inappropriate for you to assume responsibilities that don't belong to you and then allow yourself to be thrown under the bus. For the corporate board association that I'm a member of, we actually did a case study with a bunch of board directors, and the consensus was, from a business perspective, that Uber and SolarWinds were wrong because they defrauded investors, and that's what causes the SEC to throw the book. If you apply contextual similarity, nobody says anything about the CISO for Clorox. They had a breach of similar size and impact. The same thing happened for MGM for their hotels, but you don't have the same outcomes because there was no fraud with MGM. For Clorox, there was just stupidity. There was fraud and defrauding investors, and that has a legal penalty associated with it that led to negative consequences. So, dear CISOs, you are not really going to be personally liable. And then my final grenade, because we're out of time, the time alarm went off. I've talked to insurance providers and insurance commissioners. If you look it up, most state insurance commissioners do not consider the CISO a corporate executive who is somebody that has the privilege of directors and officers insurance. And so until insurance commissioners start saying this role needs that level of protection, it may inspire some reorganization of responsibility, accountability, and who's consulted and who is informed about the security things in your organization. So thank you guys for coming. God bless you. Have a great weekend. My condolences to those of you who have lost service members who were supporting the country, and I look forward to seeing you next time.